Hello everybody, SlimKirby here, and welcome to a slightly different type of video. With this year's Super 16 finally done and over with, I decided to make a video talking about the event overall, and my general thoughts on the event and each challenge. This is honestly something I've wanted to do for the last few events, considering this is the 4th year I've been doing this, but I think I was a little more motivated this year because this list impacted me the most, for good and bad reasons alike. So I felt more inspired to get my thoughts out there. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but I don't want to spend all day on it, so let's go ahead and get started. So for starters, and for those who are unaware, what is the Super 16? Well, it's an event held on the Twitch channel network SpeedGaming, which, if you've been around my streaming channels the last couple of years, you know that is where I've done a lot of various speed racing competitions and commentary sessions, most notably for Link to the Past Randomizer. The Super 16 has been an annual event, with this year being the 7th installment, although I started participating in these events in 2020 with Super 16 number 4. Every year, the organizers of the event select 16 different SNES games, and the goal is to basically complete a challenge in each game and see how fast you can complete all 16 challenges on the day of the race. The challenges are mostly progression-based, so you'll see stuff like beat World 3 in this game, or complete this many cups in a racing game, or beat this many opponents in a fighting game. Very generic stuff like that. However, if a game is short enough, you may actually be beating the entire game for one challenge, so keep that in mind. There's really no prize for the winner of these Super 16 races. It's purely just for fun, and in the interest of celebrating not only an awesome console with a historic gaming library, but also celebrating the retro speedrunning communities of these games for discovering so much about these titles and how much they can be broken and beaten quickly. This event is hosted on a network called SpeedGaming, after all. What's great about this event, though, even if you have no intention of beating these games too fast or even getting into speedrunning, it's still a great way to play some games that you may have never played before, and potentially find some new favorites. Two games that I discovered through this event that I really enjoyed were Skyblazer and Demon's Crest. Two games I had only heard about in passing, but after playing them for Super 16, I actually found myself fully playing through the games after the event, and they were some good times. There's also a dedicated group of players for this event that don't even practice the games before the race, and go into the event completely blind. And let me tell you, with how difficult some of these games are, that's an incredible accomplishment, and I give kudos to those who attempt that. Through these Super 16 events, I've accomplished a lot of things. I've made it through some tough games like Battletoads and Battlemaniacs and Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage. I've pulled off some very interesting and game-breaking sequence breaks in Super Turrican and Secret of Mana, and I've played some very bottom-of-the-barrel content in the form of Bubsy 2, Home Improvement, and Cool Spot. Overall, I've been pretty proud of my performances in these events. I've definitely had my struggles, particularly during my stream practices, more on that later, but I've at the very least managed to get through the entire event in decent standing. All of my times have been under the 6-hour mark, and I felt pretty good about that because 6 hours is usually the amount of time the SpeedGaming broadcast lasts, which means I'm usually one of the last ones to finish on air before they close the commentary booth. So it's fun to watch back the race and see how the commentary reacted to some of the cool and/or silly things that I did. As far as my general preparation for this event is concerned, the main thing I did was play all 16 challenges casually first. That way I could get a feel for how the game plays out, what to expect from the games, analyze what games I might need more practice on than others. You get the drill. Afterwards, I played through them all again while timing myself. That way I could get a grasp on how long some of these were and get a better idea of what games I needed more help with and what ones I could do with more safety strategies than speed-based ones. And from then, I just kept keeping track of all my personal bests and kept lowering them whenever I got a chance to practice them, until I felt my overall time was at a place I considered comfortable. I did a majority of my practices on stream because in preparation of the event, I didn't want to be too messed up by playing a bunch of other games alongside my Super 16 games. However, I think in future events, if I decide to participate again, I may just forego the stream practices, as I tend to get a bit angry and ragey when things don't go my way, especially when I'm also dealing with the pressures of communicating with my viewers and trying my best to be entertaining. And I tend to have more success in my practices when I do them offline anyway. So that's probably something I'm going to have to start doing in 2024. But that's speaking too much into the future. Let's get to talking about this year's events and the games. I'll go through each of the games in order, as we had to do all these games in the order of how they were listed during the event's initial reveal. As far as the games that got selected, since the first Super 16 event, they've been doing the games in a somewhat chronological order. Usually each event is associated with a different time period, and for this year's event, we were kind of in that late 1994 and early 1995 era. So basically post-Donkey Kong Country, but pre-Donkey Kong Country 2. I use that example because we had Donkey Kong Country last year, but didn't do DKC2 this year, and I fully expect them to cover DKC2 at a future date and time, maybe even at next year's event. I have no idea if the Super 16 organizers plan to cover every single SNES game, but they have definitely skipped some along the way, and I have no idea if they ever have plans to reset the list over and fill in any of the holes, or potentially even do some redos once they make it to the end. That's entirely on them to decide, but it would be great to see this event make it through the whole library at some point in the future, as unrealistic as that might seem. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on with the game list. The first game we had for this list was none other than the game Wild Guns by Natsume, a shooting gallery type of game that takes place in the Wild West that also has elements of sci-fi and steampunk influences. How interesting. You control your character as well as the crosshairs for your weapon, and you have to shoot down as many enemies as possible while also dodging bullet after bullet, projectile after projectile, and explosion after explosion. Honestly, after playing a bit of this game, I felt like I was dodging more than I was shooting things. For the Super 16 challenge, we had to beat the intro stage along with 3 additional stages, because after you beat the intro stage, you get a choice of 4 other stages you can complete in any order, much akin to the likes of Mega Man games, for example. A majority of the stages consisted of 2 screens of endurance, lasting as long as you can until the timer runs out, where shooting enemies will also lower the timer a bit faster, followed by a quick mini-boss encounter, and then 1 screen of a much bigger boss that has multiple parts and phases, and bigger attacks to dodge and avoid. Once you beat 3 of the 4 post-training stages, you were good to move on to the next game. This challenge was admittedly a tough one to start with. Overall, I think the game itself is pretty fun, especially if you get the chance to play this cooperatively with a friend, but when you're doing this single player, it definitely doesn't pull any punches. You really have to be good at dodging attacks, because if you get hit just once, you will lose a life immediately, and you don't have a huge pool of lives to pull from. And if you get a game over, you have to start the entire level over again. Thankfully, the game has unlimited continues though, so you'll never have to start completely fresh at least, but if there is one stage that starts kicking your butt, it can be a bit discouraging. I definitely had a lot of tough practices for this game, and although I had a few runs that went well, I can't help but feel like I got lucky more than I exhibited skill, if that makes sense. So this one was a bit of a hard one for me. I think the biggest challenge is just knowing when to shoot, when to dodge, and in some cases, how to dodge. It's kind of awkward trying to not only move your character, but also trying to move your character in conjunction with your aiming crosshair, especially in some of the boss fights. Thankfully, there were some things you could take advantage of though. Both characters had a super powerful screen nuke attack that could do some heavy damage to enemies and bosses, and there was even a lasso attack you could use to freeze an enemy in place for a few seconds. Very effective if you could stun lock certain mini-bosses. However, the screen attacks were of course limited, and you had to find bombs along the way if you wanted to obtain more uses of them. And the lasso attack, while useful, I found it kind of awkward to pull off consistently and time efficiently. There were also gun power-ups you could get along the way, which could increase your firepower and fire speed, but you have to be careful because sometimes you could get a pop gun that did no damage whatsoever, and you basically had to just dodge for the entire duration. There's also the Vulcan gun, where if you fill up your meter, you get a super powerful gun that also makes you invincible for the entire duration. You fill up that meter by shooting other bullets and projectiles, which is kind of a neat thing to take advantage of, but super risky knowing that if you miss a projectile, you'll likely get damaged and lose a life as a result. Whenever you get the Vulcan gun though, it was usually a blessing, and if you got it during a boss or mini-boss fights, even better. Like I said before, this was a hard game to get through, but I wouldn't say it was the hardest. It definitely took some practice, and memorizing certain aspects and mechanics of the game is definitely advisable if you wanted to have at least a somewhat decent finish time for this challenge. I think it probably could have done with one less stage for this challenge though, as I don't think doing 3 of the levels added much over 2 levels if I'm being completely honest, especially considering you can pick which stages to do anyway. If I had to put this challenge into a tier list of sorts, I'd probably have this on the lowest tier. I honestly don't see myself playing this game single player ever again, although I did have fun playing co-op with my friend Odinspec a few years ago on the Nintendo Switch Online. Having a buddy to help you through the hellacious bullet hell this game will put you through did ultimately make it a much better experience. Next up, we have an EA-published game by Granite Bay Software in the form of Jungle Strike. This game is a top-down, helicopter-based shoot-'em-up where you must fly around, shoot stuff, and complete various mission objectives. That's pretty much it, and I don't really have much to say beyond that. For this challenge, we had to complete the first 2 levels of the game, and while that does seem like a very short objective, it was certainly not a fast one. These levels are huge. The helicopter doesn't move incredibly fast, and some objectives have you going all over the map to complete them. Basically, there's a lot to do here in just one level of the game, and doing 2 of them just made this challenge feel a lot longer than it appeared. Anyway, I must be honest here though, this game was easily looking to be my least favorite challenge of the event. Not only was it just really slow and also kind of jank to control and play, but the game was also incredibly unforgiving. You only have 3 lives to start, and due to how vicious the enemies can be, not to mention how numerous they are, I could barely even get through half of level 1 without getting a game over, and sure enough, if you do get a game over, it's back to the very beginning of the level. I did not see how I could beat this challenge, and I almost considered backing out of this year's event because of this challenge alone. It was just too much to take, and I wasn't having any fun with this game. Thankfully, though, there was a light at the end of the tunnel as the Super 16 organizers ultimately decided to allow a password code that would give the player a max number of 255 lives for each level, with the added stipulation that you cannot use any of the other advantages the password would give you. This was all that was needed to make this challenge bearable, and I'm very thankful this was given consideration, because I seriously felt like I was backed into a very uncomfortable corner with this game. Even in my best runs of this challenge, I still died around 10 times in just one level, which is way above the 3 life limit. There's just too much stuff to avoid, and dodging the stuff didn't make it any easier, considering the helicopter felt like such a chore to control. Thankfully, level 2 was a lot more bearable than level 1, not to mention shorter, but even it had some annoyances with how long it took to take out the nuclear subs at the end of the mission. And even beyond that, I still died more than 3 times in this level in even my best attempts. So once again, the max lives code came in clutch for me getting through this. Once again, I just didn't enjoy this very much. It felt clunky, was slow, was really hard to get through, the levels themselves were just way too big, and looked incredibly bland, and sometimes if you aren't careful, you could accidentally fail a mission without realizing, and if that happens, well, you gotta do the whole thing again regardless of how many lives you have. So even though the max lives code did add a very comfortable buffer for this challenge, it was still probably one of the lowest parts of the event for me. I never see myself going back to this game for any reason, and even if I do, you can bet that I'm using the lives code to carry me through the whole thing, because I just don't see how I could ever do this without it. So I'd probably even put this lower than Wild Guns in the tier list, if I'm being honest. For game number 3, we're getting back to a more comfortable territory for me, and that's because we have a platformer this time around. Next up, we have Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel, created by Iguana Entertainment. This is apparently a spin-off of the Arrow the Acrobat series, which I haven't played, but I at least recognize the name as opposed to this one. Anyway, in this game you control a ninja squirrel named Zero, who jumps around, throws ninja stars, and can do a variety of different ninja-like maneuvers to get around. The goal for this game was to essentially beat 3 worlds or 6 levels. The first world wasn't too bad, both levels basically just required you to move right the entire time, and jump a couple of times, and that's pretty much it. The second world was a bit more involved, as there were a variety of different paths and sections to go through. Plus, the game finally decided to introduce boss fights in the equation as well. 2 having like 4 different mini-boss encounters in one level, which I thought was a bit obsessive. And then World 3 was once again a bit more linear, but there were some tricky sections that required you to use some advanced movement techniques to get through, and of course, a few more boss fights. Overall, I wouldn't say this game or this challenge was terrible. The controls were a little less than ideal for me, but at least seemed like the game had infinite continues, and you got to start on whatever level you game overed on, not at the very beginning of the game, or even the world, which was nice. Also, the bosses in this game had a nice quirk where if you died on a boss fight and still had an extra life or 2, the boss would have whatever health level it was at when you died. So if you made a mistake and died when the boss was close to death, you could at least come back and finish it off without the added pressure of weakening it again. And as someone who is prone to making mistakes when I'm in unfamiliar territory, I did like having a bit of a buffer like that. However, even though the challenge wasn't bad, I wouldn't say this game landed any higher than okay territory for me. The controls did feel really clunky, the type of controls where it's hard to get moving when you're at a standstill, but also hard to stop when you get on the move, which led to a lot of accidental hits and deaths that I wasn't ready for. Also, there were some parts of World 3 that required a bit of trial and error. There's a move called the Super Glide or Super Dive or something where you dive down with 0, but you use the momentum to change direction and turn yourself upwards to get some vertical distance higher than you would be able to get with a normal jump. This move is required to get through a part of this world, and if you mess it up, you will lose a life, and expecting the player to master that, especially when you're not even sure how deep or how long the section is, was kind of a jerk move. I do see how this game can be fun to speedrun though, as the movement and jump maneuvers of the game were kind of fun to learn, and it was kind of cool seeing how fast you could go in just the first 2 levels when the threat level wasn't particularly high. Overall though, while I did enjoy my experience with this game more than the previous 2, this is still not a game I'm really that set on coming back to. It was okay, but nothing really that groundbreaking for me personally. Also, some of the death animations in this game were particularly gruesome, so watch out for that if you get kind of squeamish with stuff like that. Moving on to number 4, it just wouldn't be Super 16 without one puzzle game, and the game we landed on for this year was Puzzle Bobble, also known as Bust-A-Move, depending on what region you live in. In this puzzle game by Taito, you have to destroy colored orbs by firing off colored orbs of your own, and making connections of 3 or more to remove them from the board. Also, if you remove a set of colored orbs, and if any other colored orbs are connected to only the blocks you destroy, they will also get removed by proxy. For this challenge, we had to beat level 25 of the game, and to make the challenge more interesting, we were allowed to use either the English or Japanese versions of the game, which do actually have some unique level differences between them. It might seem weird to allow this, since 2 different players can have completely different experiences based on what version they play, plus the Japanese exclusive levels are just naturally easier, but I think the organizers just wanted to be all-inclusive and just allow some different options here. Honestly, this challenging game was really fun for me. I personally hadn't played this particular game before, but I had played a variation called Snood a long time ago back in my high school's computer lab, so I knew what I was getting into here. My only frustration is that it can be really difficult to aim your shots sometimes. You may have a particular shot in mind to clear some parts of your board, but if you don't get the angle just right, your orb might latch onto a place where you don't want it to, and that may block you off from completing the level with a faster time. Kind of one of those scenarios where the game could be really fun and addictive casually, but probably a bit trickier to master in a speedrun sense. Thankfully though, if you ever fail a level and lose a life, your next attempt will have a more helpful aiming reticle that will help you make those tricky shots a lot easier, as you'll have a better idea of where your shots will aim at, even when you bounce it off of walls. So if a level is giving you too much trouble, you can intentionally fail and try again with an easier aiming line. But yeah, this was a fun one to do, and I kind of wanted to play more of this game after the event, so this is easily the best challenge so far. And for those wondering, yes, I did ultimately choose the Japanese version. I was skeptical at first because I honestly didn't see how it could be that much faster, but no, it was. On average, my times were generally about 5 minutes faster than the English version. If it was only like a minute faster, I would have still repped the English version instead, but I couldn't resist the siren song of a much lower and sweeter PB. Okay, well, how about some Mega Man X2, because that's our 5th game of this Super 16 extravaganza. This was actually one of the games I was looking forward most to playing for this year's event, because not only do I really like Mega Man X and hadn't played this game yet, but Mega Man X was also a part of the very first Super 16 event I did, so it was kind of a tribute to my first outing. Also, like the first outing, the goal for this challenge was to be all 8 Mavericks, basically doing everything shy of endgame and any optional content. I'm going to go ahead and say this right now, this was way too long of a goal. I thought it was already too long in Mega Man X, and I felt the same way about this one as well. Unless a game is incredibly short, I just don't think you should be playing more than half of a title for these challenges. I'd say doing only 4 of the Mavericks would have been way more ideal. Maybe even 6 if you did want to push it a little because of the game familiarity. That's just me though. Aside from that though, I can't deny that I did have a lot of fun with this game, and this was definitely one I wanted to revisit as a top priority when I did ultimately finish up with the event as a whole. I don't consider myself an amazing Mega Man player by any stretch, but I do have a lot of fun playing the games, and they do feel very rewarding when you get through the games, or even just by making simple progress. Every time you beat a boss, you get a new weapon, and potentially a weapon that will help you beat another boss more easily. And that's game design I can get behind. It's like every step of progress unlocks another piece of the puzzle, and you really feel like you're growing and learning from the experience. Again, I just think the goal is a bit too long. Otherwise, this would easily be my favorite challenge from the entire event. Aside from the length of this challenge, I honestly didn't think it was that hard though. Plus, since I'm pretty familiar with most Mega Man games, I kinda knew what to expect here, even if this was essentially my first experience with the game. I started with Wire Sponge, a very easy Maverick to take down with just your X-Buster, and made my way around the Maverick list following the weakness chain until I was at the end with Overdrive Ostrich. I also grabbed a few heart tanks, sub-tanks, and the arm and body upgrades, just for some additional power and defense, just in case you were curious about my route for this challenge. From one sequel to another, for game number 6, we have Lemmings II, The Tribes by DMA Design. Now, you guys should know that I'm a huge fan of the original Lemmings on PC, and I even did a full Let's Play of the Super Nintendo version on my YouTube channel, as well as speedrunning the game during the most recent Pack Game Minithon on the Stack Game Marathon Twitch channel back in March of this year. Lemmings was a game I grew up playing with my dad as a kid, and has a lot of special nostalgia for me. However, my experience with Lemmings 2 was practically zero. I didn't know what to expect, and I didn't even know if it would play the same way, because whenever I had seen the game before, it just seemed and felt so radically different from what I grew to expect from the first game. Unlike the previous game, where there were 4 difficulties and 30 levels in each difficulty, this game is spread out among different worlds, where each world has a different theme and level variety, and 10 levels to get through, instead of having a different amount of each Lemmings for each level, and certain amounts you have to save in each level. You're given all of your Lemmings from the very beginning of each world, and your goal is to get as many as possible to the very end of the world. There are no amounts of thresholds that you must meet for each level, just as long as you have one survivor, you will at the very least beat the world in question if you can get to them to the end. And the goal for this particular game was to just beat any 2 worlds of the game, meaning you essentially had to complete 20 levels for this challenge. However, due to the mechanics of this game, the strategy of this was relatively simple for the most part. Kill every Lemming you own except for one, and brute force the rest of the levels with that single Lemming. Brutal, I know, but those are the breaks when it comes to the Super 16. For this challenge, I chose the Cave Lem and Egyptian levels. I was told those 2 were the easiest and fastest to complete the goal with, and after playing through them and feeling pretty confident in my times, I pretty much in agreement with that. A lot of the levels were pretty brainless, and most of them really only required 2 quick inputs and the speed up key to complete. There were a few levels that were a bit more involved than that, but most of the solutions were pretty obvious once you knew the tools you were working with, and what you could see on the map in front of you. Overall, I like this challenge. Maybe it was a bit longer than what some people were wanting from this, and I can understand that, but I think my nostalgic bias kind of helped me enjoy this one more than probably a few others would. I will say though, I'm not entirely sure how inspired I will be to play more of this game just yet. Getting through all the levels I needed to with just one lemming was one thing, but knowing me and my perfectionist nature, I'd be a little more inclined to try and get the best scores for each of the levels, and I feel like a lot of levels will be way more involved than what was required for this challenge. Also, the interface of the game compared to the first one just feels a bit more awkward to me. There are also way more tasks in this game compared to the original, and some of them just seem flat out unnecessary, or very similar to another task that basically accomplishes the same function, which just makes the game seem more bloated than it should be. There's also a fan icon that you apparently use in conjunction with some of the tasks, and I don't know if I was doing it wrong or something, but it felt impossible to control at times. If anything, that's probably more of a reason to avoid this version on SNES, and potentially find a version that's compatible with PC, or at least has mouse functionality, which... Oh, okay. I just checked and this game is at least compatible with the SNES mouse accessory, which is something that it has going for it. Maybe I'll try that next time I play this. Anyway, let's move on to the next game. Game number 7 was Top Gear 3000 by Gremlin Graphics and published by Kemco, and it is also this year's Super 16 racing game. First and foremost, I had challenges with this game, but not the type of challenges you are probably expecting. You see, this is the only game of the SNES library to use the special DSP-4 enhancement chip, which is essentially used for how the racing tracks are drawn and visualized for the player as they are racing on them. Because of how important this particular chip is, this can be a very hard game to emulate without some kind of necessary firmware. You see, I initially wanted to do this year's list on my SNES Classic system, but due to emulation problems with this game and another game on the list, I eventually moved back to my classic SNES 9X emulator instead of using my SNES Classic, and I would have much preferred the latter because I don't exactly have a great PC controller for these retro games. I know there is a workaround for this game to get it working on the SNES Classic, but I just really didn't want to bother with it and didn't feel like switching to another emulator for 2 games during the event either. So I just did what worked for all 16 games and just used my emulator for all of them. Aside from those difficulties though, this challenge was very easy. You essentially just had to complete 4 tracks on easy mode, and that was about it. Although I'm more fond of racing games like Mario Kart or even my favorite racing game that we did last year for Super 16, Uniracers, this game was relatively smooth to get through and wasn't too hard to get a good time on either. Heck, you didn't even have to finish in first in any of the races either. As long as you finished in the top 5, you were pretty much good to go. One of the big draws of this game is the fact that you can alter your stats and use the money you gain from races to improve your vehicle. And I did not do that a single time because I didn't want to mess with that stuff and didn't want to waste any time with random menu navigation either. Besides, it was only 4 races, and because it was easy mode, I honestly didn't feel like any of the other racers put up much of a challenge. The racing itself felt pretty intuitive as well. I wouldn't say it was the best controlling racing game, but it felt easy enough to control, and the tracks weren't too crazy either, at least from what I had to play for this challenge. Would I play this game again? I don't know. I'm not against the idea, but I'm definitely not in a rush to play more of this. I guess when it comes to racing games, I'm just more about Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing, as opposed to more realistic racing sims like this one. That's just me, though. We're about to reach the halfway point of this year's list, and what do we get as a reward? Hagane, the final conflict. Oh, damn, that's a pretty hardcore reward. Okay, so this was admittedly one of the games I was the most worried about when I saw this year's list. I had heard from multiple sources, including one of the commentators that announced this list, that this was probably one of the hardest SNES games of the entire library. And make no mistake, this is a difficult game and can be downright brutal and unforgiving at times. But I've made it through Battletoads, I've made it through Maximum Carnage, and I've made it through Home Improvement. Surely I can make it through this game too, right? Well, at the very least we only had to beat 4 worlds for this challenge, which, while that is still quite a bit of the game to get through, it's not the whole game, so I was at least taking solace in that. Also, apparently this game was published by Hudson Soft too, which, hey, if the same company that's associated with Mario Party and Bomberman also has ties to this game, that alone will help drive my interest a bit more. So here's the deal with Hagane. In this game you control a ninja, and with your ninja you have a variety of different tools and weapons at your arsenal. I mostly use the sword for my close quarters combat and the kunai for distance attacks, but you also have a grappling hook and some explosive bomb items that you can use as well. You also have a couple of charge-up attacks that function as really powerful direct attacks and or AoE moves. And much like Wild Guns, you also have bombs that act as screen nukes, but you only have a finite amount of them, so you should probably only use them when it's appropriate or if you need to clutch out a boss fight or something. It's pretty standard fare when it comes to what to expect from this game, really not much different from Zero or even Mega Man X, just with more linear stage progression. But what makes Hagane difficult? Well, each stage is filled to the brim with tons of enemies and obstacles to avoid, and Hagane himself is not incredibly bulky. To start, he can only take 3 hits before he dies, and although you can increase his health up to 5 hits, those health extensions only last until you take a death. So, most of the time, you'll only have 3 hits, and you're not always guaranteed a health extension, since they're not in every level, and although they can be dropped by enemies, they are not very common drops either. Also, if you manage to land in a bottomless pit or get struck by another one-hit KO obstacle, those extensions will be lost in that manner as well. So you really have to be careful in this game, which if you're playing this for the first time, you may not know what to expect from certain segments or parts of the game in general. This can be pretty punishing if you make it to a new part with max health, but then lose it all by not knowing what to expect or what's coming up around the corner, meaning you'll likely take a death and have to retry under stricter conditions, which I think is a little annoying. I feel like permanent upgrades of that nature should at least be kept until a game over at the absolute least, much like the bomb nukes you can get in this game. That way, players can take advantage of acquiring those items if they are having trouble getting past certain sections, but aren't just grinding large amounts of them to make every section or boss trivial, if that makes sense. Regarding game overs, I was at least happy to discover that there are infinite continues in this game, as that was something I was fearing when I heard how difficult this game was generally considered. Now, when you do get a game over, you do have to start an entire world over from the very beginning, and there are some hard stretches of the game you'll have to get through, but I'll always take infinite continues in a hard game over finite continues in, well, pretty much any other game. I just think punishing a player for having to start an entire game over when they are still working their way through it is just a very outdated gaming concept and a relic of the past that I think should have already started being phased out with the discovery of battery saves or even a game password system. That's just me though, and that's the hill I'm going to remain on. With all things being said though, even though Hagane is a difficult game, I wouldn't say the game felt unfair. Enemies themselves, although plentiful in number, never really dealt contact damage, only damage if they are actively engaging attacks at you or shooting projectiles, so hitboxes honestly did feel pretty generous considering. Honestly, the only things that felt rough with Hagane was the general movement control of the character, and of course those moments I spoke of earlier where you'd enter a stage not knowing what to expect, and getting caught off guard by a random boss or section that would change the gameplay dramatically. An example of the latter is in World 1, where the game just randomly decided to throw an auto-scroller at you right before the boss that has a ton of bottomless pits that would kill you in one shot regardless of how much health you had, requiring you to almost kind of memorize where the pits would be for future attempts at the level, something I don't consider good game design personally. Getting back to how Hagane controls, it admittedly does feel a bit stiff in places. In what I played, I wouldn't say the platforming itself was that complex, but sometimes making a simple jump from a platform to platform did feel a bit off at times, as Hagane gets more vertical than horizontal distance when he jumps, so that was a bit of an adjustment for me. You also have a rolling jump, which turns Hagane into a ball and carries him a decent distance forward horizontally. However, you can only activate this roll maneuver by pressing the jump button twice in quick succession, and if you wait too long after jumping, you just won't perform the move at all, which can cause you to potentially mess up the platforming section you are on, and potentially lose progression, which is never fun to do. I must admit, there honestly is a lot of potential here for this game, and I was pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed playing this. Do I wish it was a little more forgiving in places? Yes. Do I wish the controls were a bit more flexible? Yes. But everything the game offered was at least workable, and now that Super 16 is done and over with, I must admit that this is a game I kinda want to see more of, especially since the challenge covered so much of the game as it is. I think the goal could have been shortened by a world, but not necessarily because it was too long, but because it could have given those like me who wanted to play more of this game after the fact, more to enjoy on my own terms. Plus, it could have also lowered the anxiety of those who may be a bit intimidated by this game's reputation. Anyway, I really like the game. Not my favorite game of the event, but I definitely experienced more positives than negatives here. And honestly, that's actually pretty cool. I was honestly really scared to play this game. Okay, well, we are officially halfway done with this list, and despite the rough start, I'd say the first half was at least more good than bad. Starting with Wild Guns and Jungle Strike was probably not the best idea, and following up with Zero was probably not ideal either, but at least the 4 games that followed were enjoyable to me, and was a nice rest from the early chaos. And rounding it up with Hagane, although still probably a hard ask, was at least an enjoyable hard game to play. So, that's at least something. But, let's move on to the second half now. Game number 9 ended up being True Lies, developed by Beam Software and published by Acclaim, based on the 1994 film by the same name. Now, I've personally never seen this movie before, so I couldn't tell you how accurate or faithful this game is to the film, but that's not really the purpose of this video anyway. For this challenge, we had to beat 4 levels of the game, and the challenge ended after beating the boss of the park stage, which was level 4. This game was alright. It's a top-down shooter game, much like in the same vein as Zombies Ate My Neighbors and Ghoul Patrol, 2 games I had played in the previous Super 16 events, and although I do still think Zombies was probably the better controlling game, this game at least felt better to play than Ghoul Patrol. My god, that was a rough way to start 2022 Super 16 event. It also kind of helped that the goal itself was honestly kind of short, and your controlling character had a pretty funny rolling somersault dodge move that was pretty efficient at dodging enemy attacks, and was just a really fast way to move through some of the early stages. It's also a kind of game where if you die, you just spend a few seconds in a death animation before you get right back up with full health, minus 1 life of course. And you only have to redo progress if you lose all of your lives and get a game over. There are no continues in this game, but there is at least a password system. So if you do get a game over, you can input the password and resume at the stage where you left off. Although the password does take life count into consideration as well. So for the event, we could only use the password we earned and not cheat to get even more lives than what we had. Which, I do feel like this ruling contradicted the organizer's decision for Jungle Strike and allowing those extra lives but not these. But I do feel like this goal was generally a lot shorter and the game was a bit more forgiving. I wouldn't say the challenge was free though. The first 2 levels are pretty easy and you can honestly just roll through 95% of the stages without really thinking about much of anything. But for levels 3 and 4, you had to be on your toes a bit more, as there are a lot more enemies to avoid and kill, and you actually have bosses to deal with as well. The bosses were easily the worst part of this challenge. They did so much damage with their weapons, and didn't react much to your own shots, and hitting them was actually kind of a pain, because you could aim in 8 different directions, but there wasn't really any sort of dedicated strafing button. You were kind of at the mercy of the game deciding whether or not your shots actually hit the enemy. Not to mention you still had to avoid the return fire, which is really hard to do at close quarters. In fact, the fast strategy for the last boss of the challenge was quite literally to walk right up to him, non-stop fire your Uzi machine gun, and just tank the damage in your own lives just to get rid of him quickly and end the challenge, assuming you had the health and lives to pull it off anyway. Overall, I wouldn't say this was a bad challenge or even a bad game for that matter, but I wouldn't say it was a great experience either. Honestly, the most fun I had of this was just rolling around avoiding enemies. I also got quite a kick out of the line of dialogue at the very end of level 3, which talks about having to destroy a public restroom in the name of democracy. It definitely gave this game a small degree of silliness and humor. So yeah, it was okay. Probably along the same lines as Zero, but maybe a little lower on the enjoyability scale, and a bit more difficult as well, just because of how brutal those bosses were. For game number 10, we have Super Adventure Island 2, another game published by Hudson Soft. I've never played this or the original game, so this was a bit of a new experience for me. However, this is more in line with the type of games I enjoy playing, as we have a very colorful platformer with a focus on exploration and some Metroidvania elements as well. When looking at this game, I almost kind of compared it to Super Metroid meets Zelda 2, if that makes sense, just with more of an island adventure vibe to it. The goal for this challenge was relatively simple, just beat the first 2 island bosses of the game, and that's pretty much it. I must admit, this was kind of a fun one to play. A nice breath of fresh air after the last 2 games, and it really got me interested in wanting to play more of the game on my own time. The first stage and boss were pretty easy to deal with, as to be expected from a video game, and although the second stage did turn up the difficulty quite a bit, it still felt like a very natural progression to me. The second level was a bit of a labyrinth though if you didn't know the right path, and if you kept going too far in one direction, you'd end up having to loop around and repeat the same 4 or 5 rooms in a row, which got a bit tedious during my first casual run. Once I knew the path though, it was pretty easy and I didn't mind it too much. The second boss was probably the challenge's hardest part. You have to face a giant woolly mammoth who has a trunk that pretty much has a mind of its own, so you have to be very persistent with your weapon swings to get it to hold still while also making sure you jump at the right time to avoid its charge attack. Once you got through the fight though, you were done with the challenge, so it made sense as a final test of sorts. Also, the random encounters on the world map, although not difficult, felt like a pace breaker in between stages. They probably have value in a normal playthrough since you can farm coins, but you didn't really need them for this run, so they kind of just wasted time the more encounters that you had. But yeah, another solid challenge that wasn't too long, but gave enough of an idea of what to expect in the game, and this is most certainly a title I would love to play more of. I might wait until after I play the first Super Adventure Island game though, just so I can have a little more of the story and see how the game series evolves into the second installment. This was easily one of my favorite challenges of the event though so far. Moving on to game number 11, we have another movie-based game by Acclaim, Demolition Man. This also happens to be one of the 2 games for this year's list that requires you to complete the game, although in the most basic settings and on the easiest difficulty, which does matter for this game in particular since easy mode, or calm difficulty as it's referred to, has less stages than the higher difficulty options. This is another game where shooting will be your main source of attacking, but unlike Wild Guns, Jungle Strike, and True Lies, this is more of a side-scrolling running gun game as opposed to a top-down or shooting gallery style. Although there are 2 levels that have the top-down perspective, funnily enough. Now, in past year's events, I've always been back and forth on games that get selected for a full completion goal. Games like Mickey's Ultimate Challenge, Sparkster, and Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, I think make sense for the goal. They are short enough games and aren't incredibly difficult to beat, and in the case of Lost Levels, since you can use warps to cut down the adventure by quite a large margin, even if the game can be difficult at times, I think it can still warrant the additional challenge length. However, I still have a bone to pick with the organizers for making Pitfall the Mayan Adventure a completion goal last year. That was probably asking a bit too much, at least for me anyway. Heck, even Lion King probably didn't need to be that long either, but at least I kinda got into liking that game a bit more. Demolition Man though, I don't know. I'm leaning more towards it being fine here just because it is a really short goal. You only have to beat 7 levels, and some of them can be incredibly short if you know what you're doing. The game itself, although I do think it controlled a bit better than Zero, still felt kind of jank at times, although I'd say a majority of the levels work with the game's mechanics in mind. The only level that really gave me a hard time was level 3, and that's only because there are numerous one-hit KO obstacles on the ground, and it was fairly easy to run straight into them. There were some boss fights too, but they were very basic and just required you to learn the pattern and alternate between shooting and defending. So, nothing too far out of left field here. Overall, this was another fine challenge, probably in the more positive half of the event, but more towards the middle than the top. I'm not sure if I would come back to play this again for the higher difficulties and unique stages though. It wasn't a bad challenge or a bad game, but I wasn't blown away by it either. and run-and-gun games aren't exactly a favorite genre of mine, unless it feels more polished like the Mega Man or Mega Man X games. That's just my own personal opinion. Next up on the list we have Ninja Gaiden. But wait, isn't that on the NES? Well, yeah, it is. But for game number 12, we have the Ninja Gaiden Trilogy Collection, which is a Super Nintendo game and therefore qualifies to be part of this event. However, unlike Super Mario All-Stars from a few years ago, we're not diving into just one game of this collection. No, we're diving into all three of them. All-Stars had at least a caveat of being the first full international release of Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, so naturally when that game came up, it made sense to make the goal based on that game by itself. However, since such a distinction doesn't occur here, we were given an assignment that featured all three games of the trilogy, and probably one of the hardest challenges of the entire Super 16 events. In case you were wondering why, or if you're unfamiliar with Ninja Gaiden's reputation, this series is known for its difficulty and brutality. When you think of retro tough difficulty, I'd say Ninja Gaiden is probably one of the first games that comes to mind. And although Super Mario All-Stars at least tried to make the classic Mario games a bit more visually stunning and approachable with infinite continues and a battery save system for those more casual sessions, this collection doesn't really do that, and if anything tries to stay faithful to its NES counterparts. Almost a bit too faithful. You still get infinite continues and a password system if you do need to come back later, but I'd say a large part of this game was mostly just copy and pasted from its original source code, with also updated music as well. What makes these games difficult, though? Well, quite a number of things, really. Ridiculous enemy knockback, particularly in sections that have bottomless pits or one-hit KO obstacles. Barely any invincibility frames when you do get hit. And just little room for error in general, especially if you're trying to make a run to get to the very end of a level or world in question. This challenge made me very frustrated while I was practicing, and although I eventually got a time I felt confident with, the struggle was most certainly real, and I can't help but feel like maybe the organizers went a bit too far with this goal selection, and bit off a bit more than what I could chew, at least personally. Speaking of which, the goal for this game was quite simply to beat Act 3 in all three games of the trilogy. Now, I will say, a majority of this challenge wasn't actually too bad. The first two stages of Ninja Gaiden 1 weren't too hard to get down, and after I got myself more familiar with Stage 3, even that one felt like just a small blip on the radar for me. My issue with Ninja Gaiden 1 was the wall clinging and wall jumping. I don't know what it was, but whenever I was latched onto a wall, sometimes it felt like I had to mash on the jump button in order to jump off, and if I wasn't ready for the jump when it happened, I could very easily miss my landing and fall to my doom, which made it a very annoying quirk of this game in question. I was convinced it was a controller problem at first, but it feels completely natural in the other two games of the collection, so it couldn't have been a controller-related issue. I just found it to be an annoying quirk of the game, that's all. Ninja Gaiden 2 definitely ups the ante quite a bit though compared to the original. Level 2 was often considered the toughest part of the entire challenge, and I can get why, as nobody likes the stage with wind mechanics, especially in a game with a very bad enemy knockback. The boss for this level also kinda sucked too if you aren't 100% prepared for the encounter. However, funnily enough, I actually had way more of an issue with Act 3 here. This level is filled with enemies, and some of them are just really obnoxious to take down, and after a while it just seems like no matter what I would do, I was constantly getting overwhelmed. Plus, a majority of the rooms have bottomless pits and flying enemies with very random patterns, so the second they catch you off guard, it just felt like no matter what, the bottomless pits just had you magnetized into their abyss, and if you got a game over in any of the 6 rooms or even at the boss, you had to do it all over again, which was just such a morale breaker. The boss wasn't so bad as you could stun lock it with the ninja clones, but I always had an issue with it breaking out for some reason. And last but certainly not least, we have Ninja Gaiden 3. Ninja Gaiden 3 honestly wasn't too bad at first. Level 1 was pretty free, and although Level 2 wasn't free, I'd say it was at least easier than the majority of the levels for this challenge, and the boss was incredibly simple too. However, Stage 3, oh my god, Stage 3. The first room of the stage is incredibly unforgiving. 95% of the room is bottomless pits, and if you get hit by any enemy, you're likely taking a death here, which made this room probably the most annoying part of the entire challenge for me. The rest of the act isn't too bad, and even the boss is fine once you know its gimmick, but I have to rant and vent about my least favorite part of Ninja Gaiden 3. So, for Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2, every act is divided up into 2 or 3 different levels. If you get a game over on a level, you start back at the beginning of that level. Not a big deal, makes sense, right? Heck, even for individual levels, if you simply lose a life, you start back at the beginning of that particular room, which is also an understandable penalty. However, for Ninja Gaiden 3, if you die in a level, you start at the very beginning of that particular level, not just the room you were in. And to make matters worse, if you get a game over at any point in the stage, you return to the very beginning of the act, not just the level. Because of this quirk, every single time I game overed in 3-2 of Act 3, I had to go through that really annoying first room of 3-1 again, and I absolutely hated that. I seriously don't get why that is a feature of this game. I know it's just paying homage to how the original game works, but come on, this is an updated version of all 3 games on one cartridge. I would expect some consistency updates to at least make all 3 games control and function similarly. That's another reason why the wall clinging bothered me so much in Ninja Gaiden 1, because I seriously did not have that issue with 2 or 3, and I feel that could have been a relatively easy fix to make. There were just some very weird inconsistencies that I don't think needed to be highlighted here, and why I respect the Super Mario All-Stars collection of games way more than this one. So, safe to say, I didn't like this challenge, and this was easily one of my least favorite goals of the entire event. And, let me be clear, I don't think Ninja Gaiden was a bad game or experience, or anything to that degree. When I did feel like I had a handle on things, the game felt relatively fun to play despite its retro growing pains. I just think the challenge was probably a bit longer than it should have been, or should have at least been constructed in a different manner, at least in a way that didn't showcase what I feel was each of the game's biggest flaws or stress inducers. An idea I personally had for this challenge was, instead of doing 3 acts from each game, doing 5 or 6 acts overall from all of the games combined. That way, you could pick and choose how much of each game you wanted to do, and different routes could be implemented for each participant based on what games or parts of the game they felt most comfortable with. For example, this is what I would have personally done if the goal was 6 overall acts. I would have stuck with the first 3 acts of Ninja Gaiden 1, as I felt those were relatively quick despite the annoying wall clinging. Then I would have done the first act of Ninja Gaiden 2, and then the first 2 acts of Ninja Gaiden 3. However, someone might be inclined to not switch any games at all, perhaps if they knew one game better than the other 2. So, I feel like there would be some flexibility there in a goal of that manner. That's just me, though. Would I go back to any of these 3 games? Probably not, and even if I did, I would be very tempted to use save states, at least in those instances that required very monotonous and repetitious level redos that I'm not sure I want to stomach for too long. Well, I suppose the only thing that could make an experience like Ninja Gaiden better would be a fun game, or at least a game I would enjoy to a much larger extent. And although fun game is most certainly subjective here, I definitely lucked out with the next title, because game number 13 is none other than Kirby's Dream Course. And let's be real, you guys know how much I love Kirby's Dream Course. I did a 100% Let's Play of the game back in 2011 after all, and of all the games in this year's list, this is probably the only game that ranked in my top 15 SNES games video that I did last year. So it was a rather nice having a game like this to look forward to, especially so late in the list when you're 75% deep in the chaos and coming ever so much closer to the end. This is also easily the quickest goal to get through, being the only game I could reliably and consistently get under the 10-minute mark on. For this challenge, you only had to beat the first 2 worlds of the game, and both of those worlds are relatively easy to complete, and doesn't take a lot to figure out a strategy to at least find the optimal route for a majority of the holes. In fact, I'd say only 4 of the holes are downright impossible to get a hole-in-one on, and even then, you can probably still figure out something to use to your advantage to make it close or set yourself up for an easy deuce. With that being said though, there was an interesting thing to consider when it came to doing this game fast. You see, whenever you get a hole-in-one, you get an extra cinematic fanfare, which lasts around 5 to 7 seconds a time. A cinematic you don't get if you get any other score on the hole. Because of this, I actually wondered if it may have been faster to try and skip getting a hole-in-one in every hole, and instead come up just short so you can very quickly tap the ball in and skip the ace fanfare. And sure enough, as the very dedicated speed demons of the Super 16 participant list put into practice, it was actually faster. So even though I had a good strategy for getting an ace on a majority of the holes in the game, it most certainly wasn't the fastest way to get through this goal, and I appreciated the different mindset involved. In fact, it actually made what should have been an incredibly free challenge for me a little more difficult because it tested me in a slightly different manner, and I approve of that. So, even though bias is heavily on display here, I think it's safe to say that this was easily my favorite challenge of the entire Super 16. But how could it not be? It's based on one of my all-time favorite SNES games, after all, which makes it an easy top pick for me. If anything, I kinda wish the challenge was a little longer, just because I would have liked to have seen more of the game get demonstrated. Anyway, I'm sorry if my earlier comments kinda spoil what the rest of the list won't be, particularly since I said Dream Course was the only game that was in my top 15 SNES title list, but we still have 3 games left, and I think I do have some interesting things to say about all 3 of them, so let's keep the ball rolling. Coming in for game number 14, we have Metal Warriors, developed by LucasArts and published by Konami. When I initially saw this game in the Super 16 list reveal, I was actually kind of excited to see how this game would be. It's another kind of run-and-gun game, something we've seen a few times in the Super 16 list already, but this game focuses more on piloting a mech and using that to blast away your opposition. And there's more than just one type of mech on display here too, so I thought the game would be kind of interesting having that dynamic in play. However, let's just say appearances aren't exactly everything. For this challenge, we had to beat the first 6 missions, or levels, in the game. Most of these missions just required getting to a certain point of the stage and or taking down a large mechanical system. Typical mech stuff, you know, but some of the missions had some creative elements to them which made each one feel unique. The first mission was relatively simple. Heck, even during my first run of the mission, I figured it out without losing a life, so that was definitely a good start. Mission number 2 was pretty much more of the same, but you do encounter a section where you must exit your mech and go on foot in order to access smaller rooms and areas. You're a lot weaker in this state and will likely be unable to take out anything that isn't your size, but it's the only way to get through some of these levels. Mission number 3 had a bit of a step-by-step process of where you had to get to a certain point, take out some guys, and then quickly make it back to the beginning of the stage so you can stop the interception of a heavily armed gunship. Mission number 4 was a defense mission where you just had to blast guys until there were no more guys to blast. And Mission 5 was another get to this point to finish the mission, but this time you had to take out a huge cannon at the end, which was actually kinda hard to take down without cheese strats. Then you got to mission number 6, and let me just say, I really wish this challenge didn't include this mission at all. Mission number 6 is actually 3 different levels in one, and in all 3 instances, you're basically just getting from point A to point B. However, the path to this objective was brutal beyond belief, and it just felt like unnecessary padding that I just didn't personally want to deal with. Here's the problem with Metal Warriors. This game can be pretty brutal. There are so many enemies and obstacles to deal with, and you will be constantly and consistently taking damage. There is no health bar on screen, but you can get a feeling for what your health is at based on the color of your mech. If your color is bright, then you have a lot of health at your disposal, but if your mech is dull and discolored, you're likely about to break down. And if you let your health get too low, you won't even be able to use your weapon to retaliate. So at that point, you kinda just have to pray and get lucky that you don't need to destroy anything else, or at the very least can find another mech to use. This can lead to a lot of frustration, especially during some of the longer missions when you actively need to use your attacks to get through much of the chaos, while that very same chaos will be unloading on you constantly. You can also restore health through some of the health boxes you can find throughout the level, but some of these power-ups are random in terms of what you will get, so they won't always be available to you. A bunch of other small inconveniences may also happen where if you leave your mech by itself at the wrong point in time, one of the other small enemy units can take over your mech and turn it into an enemy, which usually results in a mission failure right away, since you may not have another mech to pilot, which can and will lead to a lot of deaths, and perhaps the game's biggest flaw, the lack of unlimited continues. That's right, this game has a finite number of continues available, and if you lose them all, you'll be right back at the start of the game. Let me just say, for the record, I almost quit this year's Super 16 because of this game and this nuance. I really hate limited continues, and for a game like this that was actually pretty tough and had many opportunities for something to go wrong at the worst possible time, I was just not ready to buckle down and try to power through this game because I just wasn't having that much fun with it. Thankfully, though, we were given a bit of a lifeline for this challenge, and that lifeline was an infinite continues hack of the game that basically made it so you could continue the game no matter how many deaths you took. I really appreciate the organizers for allowing this, because I do know they wanted the experience of this event to at least be authentic to how the games were initially supposed to be played, which is why we weren't allowed to use save states along with any other emulation features. By allowing this hack, I think it just allowed the participants to be able to relax with this game a whole lot easier, and prevented players from getting incredibly punished by taking a deep game over in what's already a very demanding game. This at least gave me some confidence in giving this game at least a second chance. I also took a few ganders at a speedrun tutorial for this game made by OmniGamer specifically for this event, who also was the creator of the Infinite Continues hack as well. And I gotta say, despite my disastrous first attempt at this challenge, the extra help did make this a whole lot easier, and I got a pretty decent time for this game as well during my practice runs. Do I like the game more though because of these implementations? Well, honestly no. It can still be quite frustrating playing this, and there are definitely some sections of the game where I just could not figure out how the developers intended for you to approach certain levels or parts of the levels in question. Going back to level 6, at one point you're given a mech that's basically a rolling ball. It can move really fast when it's on a roll, but can't actually attack until it's standing still, which means there's quite a bit of setup required to even use this mech efficiently. What makes it worse is that they put the mech at the very end of the section, which means you'd expect to take this mech along with you, right? Well, you can, but the next part of the level is incredibly awkward with the mech. However, if you send a charge shot straight up at a vertical shaft near the exit plane, you'll be able to access a spider mech that's way more preferred for the next mission. The only problem is, how are you expected to figure that out? The game doesn't tell you, oh hey, this next part will be hard with your current machine, maybe you should find another one. You're just expected to try something random and hope to get lucky for it. It also doesn't help that the first part of level 6 is also a gauntlet of its own, with various turrets, cannons, and obnoxious missile robots that can literally decimate more than 50% of your health in one attack. So by the time you get to the end of that section, you're probably just ready to leave at that point. This was a game that I could really only tolerate through speedrun cheese strats, and that's really as far as my kudos can go for it. And keep in mind, I said tolerate, not enjoy. I did not have fun with this game, and I don't see myself ever wanting to come back to it. Which again is a shame because I do think there were some good ideas for this one. The execution just did not do this game any favors, and as a result, this was definitely a Super 16 low point for me during the preparation for this event. Game number 15 in our penultimate game of the event is another annual Super 16 staple, as we have this year's RPG title, Terranigma, developed by Quintet and published by Enix. And yes, the same Enix you're probably thinking of. Terranigma also happens to be the third game of an action RPG series on the Super Nintendo that was preceded by Soul Blazer, which was played in the third Super 16 the year before I joined, and Illusion of Gaia, which was in the fifth year's event. I did actually enjoy what I played of Illusion of Gaia, and this game looked like it was going to be played in pretty much the same way, so I was looking forward to getting to play this. The goal of this challenge is to defeat the Shadowkeeper boss fight, which to me I considered the first true boss fight of the game. You had some mini exchanges and fights throughout the challenge as well, but this fight in particular actually seemed to be at least the ending of the game's first act, which makes sense as a goal requirement. Now, the RPG goals have generally been pretty lengthy in past events. I can't speak for the first three obviously, but it's generally no surprise to see these games as some of the longer goals in these events. The extra link never really bothered me that much though, except in Secret of Mana's case when we played that 3 years ago, but that was more due to the game's controls and how the game was set up mechanically, making it a generally tougher challenge. I did feel like this goal felt a lot longer though, and that's because of how dialogue heavy the first 5 minutes of the game are, and then 4 other cutscenes that happen along the way to the goal in question. Essentially for this challenge, you're beating 5 mini-dungeons. The dungeons themselves are pretty quick, especially if you just rush to the end, and since it's an action-based RPG as opposed to a turn-based one, leveling up is not as important, except for general damage output, as you can technically avoid enemy attacks if you are careful enough. At the end of each dungeon, though, you have to sit through about a 1-minute cutscene. Now, this is fine during race day, as you could use this time to use the bathroom, or grab a bottle of water or something, since there is that small lull in the action. But when that isn't applicable, I'll admit that it did kind of break the pacing a bit, and made this game kind of a slog to get through after doing multiple practice attempts. And that's not something I felt as much during the Illusion of Gaia or Final Fantasy VI goals from the previous year's challenges. It didn't make the challenge unfun or anything. In fact, this is probably one of the games I would love to play more of because we only scratched the surface here. But those factors kept me from wanting to practice this one as much as the other ones. If you like Illusion of Gaia, you'll probably really like this game as well, because gameplay-wise, it's set up incredibly similarly. I do feel like this game kind of controls worse than its predecessor though. It's not as extreme as going from Zombies Ate My Neighbors to Ghoul Patrol, but it definitely felt a bit stiff, especially when trying to move in diagonal directions. The variety of challenges in just the first few mini-dungeons, though, was kind of cool and creative, and that's the reason for why I would love to see more of this game. I also got a kick of how during the cutscenes, the dialogue claims that you have resurrected the continents that exist in the real world, like Eurasia, Africa, South America, and Wyoming. I know it's actually North America, not Wyoming specifically, but me and my chat kept making jokes about how the 4th continent was just going to be called Wyoming instead of its actual name. Glory to Wyoming, I guess. Despite some of the flaws I found with my experience with this game, overall I'd say this was still one of the better challenges of the year. I imagine it can be kind of hard picking a goal for these RPG titles, since you don't want to be playing the game for too long, but you don't necessarily want to aim too low either, because then it might just be too much about text mashing. I feel like this had a great goal to aim for, it just had a little more downtime in between that probably wasn't super ideal. Still a fun game though, and a great game to close before the finale. Speaking of the finale, what do we have for game number 16? Historically in the Super 16, we've had goals that require the participants to beat the entire game. Usually these games are pretty short to accommodate this goal, but the difficulty has most certainly varied. The Magical Quest and Sparkster have been previous finales, and they're generally simple games to beat in a relatively harmless amount of time. And even though Lost Levels and The Lion King have also been used as closers, games that do have a little more difficulty associated with them, they were at least short enough that they could be completed in around a 20-minute time period with some dedicated practice. So how does Castlevania sound? Because Castlevania Dracula X was this year's finale. Honestly, I didn't know what to think at first when I saw this game pop up. I don't have a lot of Castlevania experience, but I generally like and appreciate the kind of games that they are. I also completed Super Castlevania 4 a couple of years ago for my Super NES Classic Completion series, so I wasn't entirely new to the franchise or formula either. But these games can still be pretty difficult, and we were tasked with beating this entire game. As far as what ending we had to get, since this game does have multiple endings, any of the endings would have been fine, but the worst ending was the one that was encouraged due to it generally being shorter. This means that in level 3 I had to jump down into the pit, and therefore not save either of the 2 ladies in the game. Sorry ladies, maybe for another time, but not for Super 16. I'm gonna be brutally honest here and not cut any corners in my assessment. This game kicked my ass, and it kicked my ass pretty hard. My first 2 runs of the game took me well over 2 hours to complete, and by the time I got around to trying this game, some of the other Super 16 participants already had time shorter than 20 minutes, so I knew I had a lot of ground to cover. Honestly, a lot of what bothered me with the Ninja Gaiden trilogy experience also bothered me here as well. The knockback, the lack of iframes, the needing to get through gauntlets of rooms with your resources intact to have an easier time with the bosses, the awkward enemy placements, especially in vertical sections where if you get knocked down, you essentially had to reclimb and try things again. Honestly, the only things this game got right was the fact that most enemies actually stayed dead when you destroyed them, and I'd say the most basic level design was done right at the absolute least, to compensate with the game's general movement. I also enjoyed the item and sub-weapon system of this game as well. It honestly felt a bit more refined than what you had in Ninja Gaiden, and the item crash system, which basically acts as a unique screen nuke for each item in particular, was fun to play around with as well, and it had some utility as a quick way to end boss fights if you had just enough juice left. But damn, there were so many walls and mountains I had to climb before I felt like I could consistently and confidently get through some of these stages, and even then, it was still no guarantee. Levels 1 and 2 weren't too bad, very basic introduction stages that would introduce you to a lot of the core mechanics and enemies you'll be dealing with, and boss fights that weren't too bad either. Stage 3 immediately began with a very annoying vertical climb that I swear was created by Satan himself and not Dracula. Even though most enemies don't respawn in this game, I hate the Castlevania bats and Medusa heads that spawn from the side of the screen every few seconds. They add so much annoyance to rooms like these when you're trying to wait for the right moment to advance, and some of the other enemies in this room I swear had sniper training lessons. There's also an annoying room where you have to ride a small platform over a bottomless pit while avoiding enemies, and while this room wasn't as bad, I swear I got so triggered by these enemies that it would constantly knock me into the bottomless pit below. However, I later learned that enemies don't knock you back if you're in a ducking formation, so in future runs, I just tanked the hits and rode my way to victory, since the level ended shortly after that anyway. Level 4 starts off a little rough, but if you make it through the first 3 rooms, the rest of the level is pretty easy, and has some healing spots to take advantage of. Just remember to bring axes to the boss fight though, as they make the fight incredibly trivial. Level 5 was a bit long, and had kind of a tricky boss fight involved with it, where it could be very unpredictable if RNG wasn't in your favor, since dang it moves fast. Level 6 had another annoying vertical section with birds and those damn skull totems that could snipe you from long distances, but I stand by it not being as bad as level 3's. The clock tower climbing sections could also be a bit irritating at times, but I felt with quick movement you could pretty reliably get ahead of most of the enemies and obstacles, so it really wasn't that bad, and the boss was probably one of the easier ones if again you had the axes with you. Then we had level 7. Oh boy, level 7. And don't worry, level 7 is the last level of the game, and in terms of getting to the boss, it's really not too bad. But then there is Dracula, the evil bloodsucker himself. One of the biggest terrors of this entire Super 16 list, and he's literally blocking the finish line. What makes this fight annoying? Well, first off, it's very slow and has 2 phases, the first of which takes forever to whittle down. I eventually found the safest and best strategy for this fight is to bring axes and basically stay in one location, at least until he warps to your space. Using the whip is doable, but it can take a long time, and if you have enough hearts, you can actually get an extra attack or 2 in with axes. The second phase doesn't take as long, as Dracula is a bit more aggressive, has a larger hitbox, and I think takes more damage too. But like I said, he is pretty aggressive, and his attacks can be relentless on you if you don't know the best way to dodge or tank them. Now, you're probably wondering when I was going to mention the biggest headache in regards to this battle. The fact that it takes place on very small platforms above a death pit that spans the entire arena. My god, why did they think this was a good idea? Now, if you didn't take extreme knockback in this game, fine. But if you're not standing on the absolute edge of the platform in the direction of where you're taking the damage from, you will likely fall into the pit and have to start the entire battle all over again. I swear, I probably took the most deaths from this one boss fight in the entire process of practicing and running this Super 16 event by itself, and I was so sick of having to go through this fight again, and again, and again. Even when I had a strat that was generally foolproof, or at least felt that way, trying to stay focused and keeping my composure was just so hard to do in this fight, that sometimes I would get so close to the end just to take a cheap hit literally inches from the finish line. This fight broke me down so hard that I was literally worried about my mental health and sanity after having to endure this as many times as I did. However, despite the difficulty of this challenge, I was able to do it a couple of times. In fact, one of my Dracula X runs ended up being a solid 35 minutes, with Drac only taking 2 tries in the process, so I was able to find some success here. However, this was still a very brutal challenge, and not one I look forward to. I think I maybe enjoyed it just a smidge more than the Ninja Gaiden trilogy, but I think that's only because this challenge had only one major low, as opposed to a bunch of smaller lows across the board. I'm happy to have overcome this challenge, but damn, it put me through the ringer, and those are scars I'll be feeling for a very long time. Now that I've gone over all the challenges, I'll talk about my general performance during the race. To preface this, before the event happened, I had an overall personal best time of 6 hours and 22 minutes. That time was the sum of my best times during practice for each goal in question. In the previous Super 16 events, I had been able to get under the 6-hour mark during both my practices and the actual event. However, sub 6 was probably not going to happen this year in either case. I got close during practice for sure, but some of these challenges were just way too long, and there were a couple of games I just couldn't break 30 minutes on. Funnily enough though, my longest time was not Ninja Gaiden Trilogy or Castlevania Dracula X. It was actually Mega Man X2, and that was not even one of the harder challenges. It again was just because it was a very long challenge. Same for Terranigma too. So when you have a lot of goals like this, a lot of long goals at that, the time really starts to add up. Moving on to race day, I finished 2023's Super 16 event with a final time of 9 hours and 4 minutes, well over 2.5 hours longer than my personal best. Yeah, my live run went really rough for me. It's hard to articulate even really what went wrong though, because seemingly something went wrong in almost every game. I started the day with a 4-second personal best in Wild Guns, which was something, but immediately lost that time and then some when I kept screwing things up in Jungle Strike, which led me to losing about 30 minutes on that game alone, and really killing my morale early on. From that point on, I just kinda kept bleeding time in all of the other games. Nothing major, but by the time I reached Hagane, I was almost an hour behind where I theoretically should have been. I lost a lot of time in the last level of Demolition Man, I lost a lot of time in Ninja Gaiden, I lost a lot of time in Metal Warriors. Heck, even Terranigma took longer because I just kept messing up the closing boss fight. And then of course there was Dracula, our lovely friend Dracula. I think Dracula was probably the single biggest roadblock of the entire day, because I swear I spent 30 minutes on just him alone, which sucks because I was actually having a really good run of Dracula X before that point, only taking 1 or 2 deaths throughout the entire run, and almost getting the big guy down on my first attempt. So yeah, it was a very unfortunate performance, but I can't say much beyond, well, it happens. Humans by nature are not flawless, and we will make mistakes, and on that day, I was making a lot of them. What I need to remember, and by extension I hope you guys remember as well, is that we can't take the mistakes too personally and try to move on from them and take solace in the victories we had obtained. And on that day, I beat 16 challenges for 16 different SNES games, and some of these games were really difficult as well. This list has widely been considered by veteran Super 16 players to be the hardest list of the entire event so far, and even some of the top runners of previous years didn't really feel like committing this year because of that brutality. And honestly, I can't really blame them, as even I thought about bowing out myself. However, I wanted to push myself, and at the end of the day, I did accomplish my goal. That alone, I think, is something to be proud of. I should also mention that during race day, I did get a 4-minute PB of Hagane, which only further proves that that game was not as bad as a lot of people were fearing, and I'm actually kind of proud of that one victory I had. Now, before I give my final assessment of the event and this list by itself, I wanted to do one last breakdown of the games, but I promise I'll be brief about it since this video is already pretty lengthy. In fact, I'll even provide a tier list graphic I made to simulate my feelings about this list. So, here's the breakdown. Kirby's Dream Course, Bust-A-Move, and Super Adventure Island 2 were hands down my favorite challenges and games that I played for this year's event. I also really enjoyed Mega Man X2, Hagane, Terranigma, and Lemmings II, but I have them one level lower because there was something about those challenges that kept it from being great, whether it was its length, difficulty, or controls. Top Gear 3000 for me kind of fits in between this tier and the next tier, but I didn't want to put it by itself, and I felt like it was closer in quality to these games and challenges as opposed to the next lowest tier. Tier 3 were games that I felt weren't bad, but also weren't great either. I kind of just tolerated them for this event because I had to. So, Demolition Man, Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel, and True Lies. Then we have the bottom tier, which are games that were just really rough for me to play, practice, and I just had a negative experience with them throughout the entire duration of this event. Wild Guns, despite being a cool concept, was just very punishing to play for someone with lacking reflexes, so it was hard to enjoy single player. Castlevania put me through hell and back, but I at least felt somewhat rewarded by my progress in getting better, so I gave it a bit of a break despite it still mostly being a negative experience for me. Metal Warriors just felt incredibly clunky and awkward, and was hard to push through without cheese and speedrun strats. Ninja Gaiden Trilogy I think was just very mishandled for not just this challenge, but also just the game in general. However, I think my least favorite game of the Super 16 would actually have to be Jungle Strike. Although probably not the hardest challenge, especially with the implementation of 255 lives code, the game itself was just not very interesting, and it didn't feel really good to play either. You could also say the need for such an extreme cheat code probably also didn't do the game any favors either. But yeah, that's my breakdown here. You could probably say this order is how I'd rank the games and challenges as well, but ranking is a bit harder because I had some games in the same tier for different reasons, so I tried to order them as best and as sensibly as I could. So overall, how would I grade this Super 16 event? Well, I'm not going to give it an actual grade or rating or anything like that because that's largely subjective anyway. All I can really do is compare it to previous Super 16 events, or to be more specific, Super 16 events that I personally participated in. And I'm going to be real, this was probably my least favorite of the 4 I've done so far, to probably no one's shock. However, I want to be clear that I don't necessarily blame the game selection for that. There was a pretty interesting variety here, and considering Kirby is the only mainstream Nintendo franchise that was repped, I think the organizers did a good job of not putting out too many heavy hitters in just one list. And with the likes of Donkey Kong Country 2, Yoshi's Island, and Earthbound very quickly on the way in terms of release window, I'm sure it was pretty tempting to use one of those mega hits, so it's probably good there was some restraint there. I also don't want to spend too much time ragging on the difficulty of these games either, because even though a number of the games and challenges were hard, again, I feel like difficulty is subjective and doesn't necessarily equate to a game or challenge being bad. After all, Hagane was one of my favorite challenges this time around, and I feel like I personally enjoyed challenges like Lemmings II more than others because I at least had the context for how the game generally functions. I think ultimately my problems with this list were twofold. One, some of these challenges were just way too long, and I think a good amount of them probably went on 1 or 2 stages longer than they probably needed to be. Even some of the challenges I did like X2 and Terranigma, still made this list feel a bit bloated, and some games like Jungle Strike, in addition to being difficult, just felt like a slog to get through at times. And 2, I think this list was incredibly brutal to runners who attempted this list blind on race day. Now, you're probably thinking, why would anyone do a sight read on the day of a big race? Especially when they give you the list of games 2 months in advance. Well, believe it or not, that is actually a pretty common occurrence for these events. Every Super 16 has a group of runners who do challenge themselves like this, and take on the endeavor of figuring out the challenges on their own volition and skill without any preparation for the race, and I personally respect that. In fact, that's one of the things that originally interested me in the event because it showed me that you didn't need to be an awesome speedrunner to participate, and anyone, no matter their skill level, can be involved with the Super 16. I personally couldn't see myself doing this without some practice, but due to my other commitments with content creation and other things going on in my life in general, I just couldn't put forth more than a few practice sessions per week personally. So while I was prepared, I probably wasn't going to be as prepared as some of the more skilled runners of this event. Getting back to my nitpick though, I think this list just had a lot of games that needed that level of practice and preparation that I think probably hurt a lot of the sight readers. Games like Jungle Strike and True Lies and Hagane, and Castlevania, and heck, even Lemmings II was probably a difficult one to stomach for those players because from what I hear, some of the worlds you could have chosen were a lot longer and more complicated than the worlds that were ultimately chosen by a lot of those who practiced beforehand. By the way, I want to give a major shout out to those who did ultimately go for this list blind, and who came out victorious by the end in addition to that. There were 4 runners who were at this thing for more than 10 hours, and the last place finisher even kept it going until the 32nd hour mark, and that's some true dedication right there. So seriously, great job guys. Ultimately, I know it's a race, and those who had the time commitment and the skill to incorporate and master the speedrun strats would be the most rewarded here in the actual race standings, but I like to think that this event is more than just being a speedrun event. Originally, this event was made to celebrate the legacy of the Super Nintendo and its powerful game library, and potentially shine some light on some titles that made the system what it was. And while I do think this year's event accomplished that, it did feel like it was a little more centered around the speedrunning part and less around the celebrating the SNES part. And again, that's just because I feel like some of the challenges were asking a bit too much or went on a bit longer than they should have. By the end of my 9-hour run, I was honestly starting to question if I even wanted to do this again, because I was literally drained of all mental energy by that point. While in previous years, I at least felt more confident and empowered in my performance overall. Ultimately, I think I'm just going to sleep on it for now. We still have many months to wait until the next game list reveal, and looking at those release windows, we have some awesome games on the way, some of which are even in my SNES top 10. And I would hate to miss out on those. Even though this was my least favorite Super 16 so far, I don't think it was a bad one. I just think the challenges and goals could have been adjusted a little more for accessibility based on what was being asked of us. Before I sign out, I do want to give some thank yous. First off, I want to thank my good friend Odinspec for being very supportive of me during my practice sessions. He was actually someone who intended on participating this year as well, but ultimately decided against it due to real-life obligations, and just because he could tell this list was going to be more brutal than the last couple of years, and didn't feel like getting into the madness, and I can't say that I blame him. And of course, major shoutouts to my entire Twitch community for supporting me as well during my many rage-filled practice sessions. I know I can be a little unpleasant sometimes when I get angry, but I can tell most of you know that I at least mean well, and I could tell you were only trying to help fill me with determination on the sidelines. I do want to highlight Magnus AM and Gaming Doc specifically though, as they did give me some advice and did do some research on some of the games for certain mechanics and things that could help me along the way, and that is always appreciated. On the subject of research, I do also want to thank the likes of Ryo, OmniGamer, Telio1, Epic, and LuchaGym for providing some of the tutorials and guides I used to get through some of the harder games. That's one of the things I also appreciate about the Super 16 community and the speedrun communities for these games in general. They're always providing resources and strategies to help all the players get through some of these games faster, and through some of the harder games more comfortably. And of course, I would be foolish if I didn't shout out the rest of the Super 16 runners for being solid people to talk to during the event downtime, and for being absolute gaming warriors for taking on an event of this magnitude. Special shoutouts to Aaron Doby though, as if it wasn't for him doing Super 16 number 3, I never would have heard about this event in the first place. And finally, a major thank you to Feasel and the rest of the SpeedGaming crew for putting on this annual marathon. I know I had a lot of reservations and negative things to say about this list, but I hope you can look past some of those comments and see that I really enjoy being a part of this event, and anything I say is out of love for your continued commitment to put on these races. Also, after the main broadcast ended, SpeedGaming even rated my stream for 200 plus viewers, so that was a rather pleasant surprise. Thank you very much. Well, before this gets any longer, I should probably cut this off here. I have no idea how long this video is going to be, but I wanted to do something special for the event, and I hope you enjoyed what I had to say. I might start doing little recaps like this after each Super 16 event from now on, so if there is any interest in that, let me know and I'll see what I can do for subsequent years. Also, if anyone is interested in participating in something like this, I'll try to make sure I give a shout out there around the time of the next game reveal. This has been SlimKirby, thanks for watching and listening, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Later, folks.